A 12-year-old girl was locked in darkness for 11 years by her own uncle. With no personal information in the system, it was as if she didn't exist. Until a billionaire reached out to help when he saw the look in her eyes. Empty, panicked, and too silent for childhood. That was the moment that began a journey to reclaim the light. For a child, the world had forgotten to remember. The sky was a greasy grey, as if someone had smeared a handful of ashes across the city's window pane. The public welfare office was so cold that day that the clicking of the clerk's pen echoed like the tapping of knuckles on a tombstone. Irene entered, slowly, tentatively, like someone wading through unfamiliar water. She was in her early 40s, with eyes nearly blinded and a back bowed as if she'd lived through several lifetimes of exhaustion. Beside her, Elena moved like a small shadow, head down, hands clenched in her mother's skirt. Silent, not looking at anyone. At the far end of the room, Daniel Reed, a tech billionaire, had just finished signing the paperwork to fund a foundation for abused children. He wasn't used to being in places like this, but today he wanted to personally deliver the decision because he wanted to see firsthand what people needed. As he was preparing to leave, Daniel stopped short when he saw the lost-looking mother and the child, silent as if accustomed to living on the floor. Elena didn't sit down, even though there was a long bench in the waiting room, empty and clean. She just stood there, back pressed against the wall, like a shadow trying to disappear. Eyes fixed on the floor, feet crossed, shoulders hunched. The receptionist gestured softly toward the bench. "You can sit down, dear." Elena shook her head, almost imperceptibly. Not with words, not with her face. Just a breath held back in her chest. Daniel noticed. It wasn't that the girl didn't know how to sit. It was that she didn't dare, as if sitting was a sin, as if somewhere in the past, simply bending down would bring a hand crashing down on the back of her neck. The receptionist frowned. She looked down at the girl, then up at her mother. "How old is she?" Irene replied softly, as if afraid her own words would shatter. 12. The entire desk froze. Daniel stopped buttoning his coat. His gaze lingered on Elena, on the small shoulders that flinched as a staff member approached. The girl shrank behind her mother. No verbal reaction, just a movement so slight it was almost invisible. But it didn't escape Daniel's notice. He'd seen children who'd been hurt. They had the same look in their eyes, not the look of children. No sparkle, no wonder, no innocence, only fear, constant, as if the whole world was a knife. The receptionist stood up, her eyes still fixed on Elena. "What grade are you in?" Elena didn't answer. The hand gripping her mother's skirt trembled. Daniel took a step closer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft enough not to startle anyone. "Is she all right?" Irene turned her head, her face haunted. "We're here to apply for medical assistance," she whispered. "My eyes... I can't see clearly anymore." "The girl? Doesn't she go to school?" Another staff member interjected. Silence again. Irene didn't answer, didn't deny it, didn't explain. Just a long sigh, as if everything had happened so long ago that words no longer mattered. Daniel looked at Elena. "What's your name?" The girl just stood there, looking at Daniel, but her hand released her mother's skirt, clenching into a fist at her side. "I think," Daniel said, turning to the staff, "we should probably call in a specialist for assessment." The staff member nodded, beginning to type on the keyboard, her fingers clumsy as if she'd never typed under the gaze of a millionaire before. Daniel walked away from the counter. He stood silently for a moment near the window, looking out at the rain-slicked parking lot. But his eyes weren't really seeing the street. They were still fixed on Elena's face, on the small shoulders that jumped at the slightest approach, on the eyes that never looked up. "Have you ever seen a child who doesn't know how to cry?" Daniel asked his assistant, his voice low. "Not because they're not sad, but because they've learned to swallow their tears so they don't get beaten for crying." The assistant said nothing. He turned back to the welfare office. Alina was still standing there. People were talking around her, but no one was really talking to her. Daniel slowly approached. He knelt down, reaching out his hand, not touching, just offering it silently. "Little one, is there anything I can help you with?" For the first time, Alina looked up. Her eyes met his, just for a very brief moment, then darted down like a door slammed shut. But Daniel had seen it. In those eyes, there was no childhood, only darkness and fear ingrained in her flesh. Daniel pulled out a business card, placing it in Irene's hand. "I'm Daniel Reed. I'm willing to help if you and your daughter need it. Please, contact me." Irene didn't look at the card, but she nodded very slightly, like someone too used to being rejected, now surprised to be heard. Daniel turned back, looking one last time toward Alina. The girl was looking down at her feet, her hand clenched, fingernails digging into her palm until it was white. He whispered to himself, but loud enough for someone to hear. A child shouldn't have eyes like that. The alleyway in the slum district barely caught any sunlight, as if refusing to shine upon it. Number 46, with its peeling walls and crooked roof, stood silent like an old cardboard box, forgotten amidst a pile of rusty cans. Alina slowly followed her mother after returning from the public welfare office. Her footsteps made no sound, as if even her sandals knew this place wasn't allowed to be noisy. Irene fumbled with the lock. She didn't say anything, just touched the lock. Then the rotting wooden door frame, familiar to her touch. Inside, it was pitch black. Not the kind of darkness caused by a lack of light, but a deliberate darkness. The darkness of black blankets nailed over the windows. The darkness of light bulbs long removed. The darkness of a place where people didn't live, only endured. A growl echoed from the corner of the house. "Leonard." Alina froze. Her body recoiled instinctively. Her hand clenched her mother's skirt, but there was no one to hold her back. Irene continued forward, her hand tracing the wall, like a blind person, memorizing every crack to orient herself. The clatter of a chain dragging across the floor. A tall, bulky figure emerged from the shadows, wearing a stained yellow tank top, reeking of alcohol. Filthy trash. What did you two go begging for this time? Leonard didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed Alina's shoulder, yanking her inside like a sandbag. Alina didn't cry out. She knew. Crying would only make things worse. He dragged her through the cramped living room, what had once been a living room, now just a place for beer cans and dangling electrical wires. He threw her down onto a wooden chair with a missing leg, forcing her to sit. His hand, as big as a bird of prey, tied rope around her. "How many times have I told you?" "Who gave you permission to look at strangers?" Alina gasped for breath. A rag was stuffed into her mouth. Her eyes widened, staring blankly at the unlit ceiling bulb. Leonard stepped back, surveying the chair as if he'd just completed an essential task. He exhaled sharply, then pointed a finger in Alina's face. "Look at you, a real piece of garbage, born without knowing how to speak, without knowing how to bow your head, only good at giving me a headache." Alina trembled, her eyes wide, but she didn't cry. She didn't dare. "How many times have I told you? Don't raise your face. Don't open your mouth. Don't breathe like you're worth anything." He leaned closer, his voice quieter, but seeping into every bone. "You're not human. You're something I've had to put up with every day since your father died, and your mother was too stupid to leave you." Alina closed her eyes, not letting the tears fall, because she knew tears angered him more. At that moment, outside in the yard, a black car was parked nearby. Daniel Reed hadn't left. He didn't know why he'd followed the two of them. Something was wrong. That feeling hadn't left him since he'd looked into Alina's eyes at the office. Then he heard a sound, like something being dragged, coming from inside. A rough male voice, cursing, a crash, something falling to the floor. Daniel opened the car door. He quickly walked towards the dilapidated house. As he approached, he saw that the door wasn't locked. He pushed it gently, and the door swung open, and he stepped inside. Before him was a scene that froze everything inside him. The girl was tied to a chair, a rag stuffed in her mouth. Her eyes were wide, as if she was no longer a child. A man was standing in front of her, still holding the piece of rope he'd just used to tie her. Daniel shouted, "Stop!" Leonard turned sharply, startled. "Who the hell are you? Get out!" He lunged forward. In a surprisingly swift movement, Leonard grabbed the doorknob, pulling it hard. A loud bang as the door to the room where Alina was tied shut right in front of Daniel. The bolt clicked into place. "I've called the police." Daniel pulled out his phone, his eyes never leaving the girl. "Get your hands off that child." Leonard stepped forward, but Daniel didn't back down. He didn't blink. "You don't know who that kid is, huh? Her and her mother live off me. Who gave you permission to interfere in my family's business?" Daniel didn't respond, just pressed the call button. His voice clear to the operator. "There's a child being abused. Urgent assistance is needed. The address is..." Leonard moved to attack. Daniel pulled out his wallet, throwing it on the ground. "You want money? Take it all. But don't touch that girl again." In that moment, Alina heard everything Daniel said. She slowly raised her head. She looked towards the door, just a glance. But in it was a desperate plea. It was the darkness she was so familiar with, now just a closed cocoon. It was an unspoken confession. "I don't know how to live, except in silence." Irene stood silently at the door of the next room. She couldn't see anything, but she could hear. She heard hurried footsteps. She heard the tightening of rope. She heard the man shouting. She tightened her grip on her skirt, but she didn't step out. Daniel didn't take his eyes off the door that had just been slammed shut. He pounded on it again, turning back to Leonard, his voice strained. "You're holding a child prisoner. I won't let this go. I raise her. I'm her legal guardian. What's it to you?" Daniel took half a step back, but his voice remained firm. "Raise her. Tying her to a chair is raising her. Stuffing a rag in her mouth is caring for her." Leonard sneered, a twisted smile like someone who no longer knew right from wrong. "You don't know anything. She's not like normal kids. She's mute. She's sick. Don't interfere in other people's business." Daniel took a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides, looking straight at Leonard. "She's not sick. She's a child being tortured every day by you." Leonard roared, "I teach her. No one else can stand her. No one else wants her. Even her mother doesn't dare say a word." Daniel snapped, "No one wants her, because people like you make them believe she doesn't deserve to live like a human being." Daniel was chased out by Leonard, who then quickly locked the door. He stood staring at the old, dilapidated, desolate house. Today, he would save the girl from this hell, at any cost. Let's play a little game with the people who only read the comments. Type salad in the comments. Only those who read this far will get it. Now, let's continue the story. Just 6 minutes after Daniel's call, the police arrived. The sound of police cars echoed from the end of the alley. No sirens, just the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the thin mist. Leonard raised his head, his eyes narrowed. He strode quickly to the window, pulling back the dusty, greyed curtain. Outside, 2 officers had just gotten out of their car. approaching with the familiar gait of those who carry power and justice. Leonard growled through his teeth, like a panicked animal whose nest had been discovered. "Damn it!" He dropped the curtain, turning sharply toward the room where Elena was tied, his eyes filled with something darker than even the darkness in the room. A loud knock echoed on the wooden front door. Leonard opened it, still with the same aggressive demeanor of a provoked beast. "What the hell are you doing here? Do you have a warrant?" One of the officers held up his badge. "We have the right to conduct an emergency investigation based on a report of child abuse." "There's no one being abused here. You're crazy. Get out." Leonard tried to slam the door shut, but another officer blocked it. In a split second, he lunged, trying to punch. But they were prepared. The two officers subdued Leonard in seconds. He continued to yell, cursing with every filthy word that no sane person could even think of. Irene sat on the sofa, unmoving, silent, uncrying, like an old piece of furniture in the house. Her eyes didn't focus on anyone. She just sat there, as she had for many years. Daniel stood outside, not going in. He didn't want Elena to see any more scenes that would traumatize her further, but he kept his eyes on every move the police made. They went to the back of the house. An officer called out, "Found a locked room." The sound of a chain being unlocked, the wooden door creaked open. The smell of mold and depression hit them like a slap in the face. Inside, there were no lights. No windows. A moldy mattress was stained with black patches like dried blood. Against the wall was a rope tied in place. The marks imprinted on the floor, not yet faded. No toys, no pictures, no signs of childhood. Only a place for silence to happen. Elena was brought out of the house, wrapped in a thin blanket. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't resist. Nor did she ask where she was going. She didn't know what the outside world would do to her. But at least she was no longer in the place that had once been called home. Two officers held Leonard tightly, handcuffed, pushing him out of the doorway of the moldy house. He still struggled, his mouth spewing curses, his eyes blazing as they swept past Daniel and Elena. Irene was led out afterwards, not handcuffed, but her steps were heavy, as if she no longer knew where she was going. Her eyes were clouded, unfocused, not looking at Daniel, not looking at Elena, not looking at anyone. An officer spoke quickly to Daniel. "Both of them will be taken to the station for questioning. The man is being held on suspicion of child abuse. The woman needs an assessment of her ability to provide care." Daniel nodded, saying nothing. He watched Leonard's silhouette being pushed into the police car, then looked at Elena and silently vowed he wouldn't let that man hurt her again. Daniel walked beside the stretcher as the paramedics took her to the ambulance. The night wind blew, making his shoulders shiver slightly. But his eyes never left the girl. He gave her a small bottle of water. Elena took it, but didn't drink. She looked at him, not to ask permission, but as if she was checking to see if this person would disappear if she blinked. Her eyes clung to him like an anchor in a black sea. Daniel squeezed his hand into a fist, saying softly, "You're safe now." The girl was taken to a children's psychiatric hospital about 20 minutes later. In the waiting room, no one spoke, only the ticking of the wall clock and the footsteps of nurses passing in the hallway. Daniel sat across from Dr. Mary, a woman in her 50s, with graying hair, experienced eyes, but without losing her gentleness. "This girl hasn't said a word," Daniel said, his voice slow. "Not even cried." Mary nodded. "She's been completely cut off from language for a long time. That severely affects the areas of cognitive and communication development." "Can she recover?" Mary was silent for a few seconds. "We're not sure if she can recover. But if there's still a glimmer of hope, it has to start with connection. Daniel looked through the glass, where Elena was being changed, her body thin, her back with red patches, as if they had never been healed. He said decisively, "I will fund the entire treatment process." Mary smiled. What she needs isn't money, but someone who won't abandon her halfway. When Elena was taken to the inpatient unit, Daniel waited for her at the end of the hallway. He held a small knitted doll, round face, brown hair, eyes embroidered with blue thread. He sat down on a chair, placed the doll in his palm, and waited. Elena approached. She didn't look at the doll, didn't look at him, but her eyes were still fixed on him, as if afraid that if she wasn't careful, he would disappear. Daniel offered the doll to her. "This is called Mia. She doesn't know how to talk, but she likes to be hugged." Elena stared, not touching it right away. Daniel didn't urge her, didn't say anything more. 1 minute passed, then 2. Then a small trembling hand slowly reached out, touched the doll, held it to her chest. Daniel breathed a sigh of relief. It felt like he had just weathered the first storm. "We just opened a small door," he thought to himself. Children are often silent because they have no one to listen. But today, for the first time in her life, Elena reached out, and someone didn't pull away. The meeting room at the small police station had walls covered in faded grey paint that had discolored over the years. The ceiling fan turned slowly, making a steady whirring sound, like the weary breath of a justice system weighed down. Daniel sat across from Police Chief Hammond, a man in his 50s, with greying stubble, a weathered face, but unable to hide his tension. On the table was a thick file that had just been opened. The first line made Daniel hold his breath. Personal file, Elena Carson. "We've confirmed," Hammond said, pointing to an old photo of a family of 3. "The girl's name is Elena, the biological daughter of Andrew Carson, Leonard's brother." Daniel frowned. "So Leonard is her uncle?" "Yes." After Andrew died in a house fire in 2014, Irene and Elena moved in with Leonard temporarily. But because Irene's health wasn't good, Leonard became the official guardian of both of them. Daniel glanced at the corner of the table. There was a copy of a death certificate with a smudged stamp. Cause of death, severe burns due to fire. Daniel flipped to the last page of Elena's recent medical file. The words were printed in bold, cold as a knife. Nutritional status, body fat only 6%. Chronic anemia. Spine shows signs of abnormal curvature, suspected due to prolonged incorrect posture. His eyes stopped mid-sentence. His hand tightened on the paper. He couldn't read on. A breath caught in his chest. This was no longer a medical record. This was evidence of destruction, silent, prolonged, and deliberate. He put the file down, closing his eyes for a second. Not because he didn't dare to look anymore, but because if he looked further, he was afraid he would scream in this already heavy meeting room. The police chief flipped to the next page. "Here's a statement from a neighbor. Do you want to hear it?" Daniel nodded. A recording was played. An elderly woman's voice echoed, apparently a neighbor. "We never saw the girl go to school. Once I asked, and Mr. Leonard said, 'She's sick. But what kind of sickness requires you to be tied to a chair all day? I don't understand. For years. That girl was like a ghost. No one even knew if she was there or not." Daniel clenched his fist under the table. The police chief closed the file. "The girl has no birth certificate, no education, no record of vaccinations. In the administrative system, Elena Carson has never existed." The atmosphere in the room sank. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes clouded. A human being, no name, no age, no history. just a forgotten shadow. "What about Irene?" he asked softly. Hammond handed him a transcript. "She's being held for questioning, but she's almost completely blind and has been completely dependent on Leonard for years. Also, a victim." A clip was played. Irene in the interrogation room, her thin hands trembling, her face without support. Her voice was hoarse, breaking off in the middle. I can't see anything. Leonard said she was cursed, said she was a burden. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do." She burst into tears, silently, just broken sobs. The scene made Daniel turn away. "What about Leonard?" he asked. Hammond sighed. "Detained for 48 hours. But because there's no clear evidence, no clips, no direct witnesses seeing him lay a hand on the girl, he could be released." Daniel raised his head. "What?" "We're doing our best," Hammond said quickly. "But the law is the law. The injuries on Alina, however severe, are not enough to hold Leonard if there isn't clear, incriminating evidence about who caused them." Daniel stood up. The chair, scraping back, made a jarring sound. He didn't speak, just stared at the wall, where a sign hung. "Protecting justice. Serving the people." What about justice for a child who doesn't know who to call father, doesn't dare call anyone mother, doesn't dare make a sound? The police chief was silent. Daniel left the room, walking down the hallway leading to the social worker's office. There, a middle-aged woman was flipping through papers. He stopped. "Can you tell me how many people knew about Alina, but remained silent?" She hesitated. "We have no record. No one reported it, and their family lived quite isolated." Daniel gave a dry laugh. Silence kills slowly, but surely. That evening, he returned to the hospital, where Alina was under special observation. She still hadn't spoken, but she had started to eat a little liquid porridge and sat still when someone gently touched her shoulder. Daniel looked through the glass. He saw her holding the knitted doll, Mia, close to her chest, clinging to it like a piece of a memory she had never had. In him, there was not only anger, it was the feeling of being called not to witness a tragedy, but to end it. He turned to Doctor Mary, his voice low. "I don't want her to grow up feeling like she's someone's mistake." Mary nodded. "Then let's be the first ones who aren't silent. But before that, she needs to be in psychological treatment." Daniel stood silently in front of the hospital room door. He clenched his fists. In his head, there was only one thing. We will end this. Forever. The therapy room was about 10 square meters, with off-white walls, no mirrors, no cameras, just natural light pouring through a small window. The floor was covered with a soft shag carpet, and several low chairs of various colors were scattered about, as if waiting for someone to come and sit down. Alina sat in the corner of the room, holding a colored pencil. In front of her was a blank sheet of paper, already stained with a few blue and gray marks. She drew slowly, each stroke tentative, not because she was unfamiliar with it, but because each line carried something too big to express in words. A solid black circle sat in the middle. Surrounding it were diagonal lines like bars. Inside, a small figure sat huddled, faceless. Outside, the circle was another figure, tall, with long, spindly arms, a large mouth, but no eyes. Dr. Mary sat across from her, not interrupting. She just offered more colors, quietly observing. When Alina stopped, Mary asked, "Is this your room?" Alina didn't nod, didn't shake her head, just pulled the paper closer, drawing a small shadow next to the huddled figure. The shadow was her mother, hand touching the wall, but not looking inside. "And this is your mother?" Alina looked at the drawing for a moment. then placed her finger on the mother's eyes in the picture and drew 2 horizontal lines across them, like a sign of not seeing. Mary understood. "You don't blame your mother, do you?" This time, the girl shook her head, gently, as if afraid even the wind would hear. "That's good for the first step. No need to be afraid. We will slowly get used to it in the following days," Mary said to Elena before leaving the therapy room. The girl simply needed time. Daniel came every day, as regularly as sunrise after a storm, no appointments, no fixed hours, but every morning the therapy room would echo with storytelling in a gentle male voice mixed with impersonations of cats, dragons, even whale songs. "Elena, today I brought a story about a girl named Star. She lived in a box for 10 years, but there's something special about her." Elena didn't ask, "What's special?" But her eyes lit up as if she knew she was about to hear something no one had ever told her before. Daniel continued, "In that box, she hid a star, and when someone opened the box, the star was still shining." For the first time in many days, Elena smiled, very slightly, soundlessly, just the corners of her mouth twitching, her eyes flashing with a hint of sparkle. Daniel didn't stop there. "Yesterday, I met a squirrel who speaks French. He said he wanted to be friends with you, but he's a little shy. Would you like that?" Elena tilted her head, clutching the knitted doll to her chest. This time, she didn't turn away. A week later during therapy, Elena drew again. But this time, the drawing had a new character, standing outside the black circle, holding a small lamp and placing it close to the bars. That figure had hair, had eyes, and had a name. "Did Elena draw Uncle Daniel?" Mary asked, her eyes touching the scrawled D on the figure's hand. Elena didn't answer. She just drew a small heart on the figure's chest, then stopped. Put down the pencil. The door opened. Daniel walked in with a duck-like quacking voice. "Quack, quack. Did someone call the duck doctor today?" Elena turned around, her eyes shining. But today, she didn't sit still. She walked forward, slowly and hesitantly, as if even the floor could collapse beneath her feet at any moment. She took his hand, not speaking, just gently pulled him closer to the drawing, then pointed to the figure with the lamp, the hand holding the letter D. After that, she placed his hand on her chest, where her heart beat very softly, but still beating. Daniel didn't say anything for the first few seconds. His hand hung in midair, then gently squeezed the girl's hand. The grip was light, warm, undemanding, unforced. Then he leaned down, whispering, as if afraid the whole room would shatter the moment. "You don't need to speak yet. I hear you." Mary stood behind, clutching the treatment file tightly. She turned away. There are types of recovery that aren't on the statistics, can't be measured by indicators, only can be felt by the breath. In a world that had once been silent to the point of suffocation, Elena had answered with the only thing she trusted, a hand placed on her heart. And Daniel, who didn't wait for the words, had heard everything. The sky was overcast all afternoon, the thick clouds seemingly swallowing the last light of day. The road leading back to the old residential area was full of potholes, cracks like unhealed scars on the face of the earth. An old grey car pulled up beside number 46, the place that had once been Elena's prison. The car door opened, and Leonard stepped out. His gait was unsteady, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't bring any luggage. The only thing Leonard carried was a folding knife, tucked in his coat pocket, and an unyielding hatred. He looked around. The area was deserted. People didn't ask questions when they saw someone returning from hell. Everyone knew, but no one wanted to get involved. The old neighbor stood silently on his porch, holding a cigarette, saying nothing. When Leonard glanced over, he just shook his head slightly, then went inside, closing the door tightly. Leonard muttered, "You think me getting arrested is the end of it, huh?" He opened the house door. The familiar smell of mold wafted out. Irene was sitting huddled in the corner of the bed, her hands feeling for a worn old photo. "She's not here anymore," she said softly. It wasn't clear if she was talking to Leonard or reminding herself. Leonard gave a faint smile. He didn't argue, didn't hit, just snorted, then opened the closet, pulling out an old baseball cap. While Irene buried her head in the pillow, Leonard quietly slipped the knife into his pocket and went outside. That evening, Daniel arrived at the hospital later than usual. Work had drawn him into lengthy meetings, but that didn't stop him from detouring to the hospital as dusk fell. He stopped in front of the inpatient unit. The glass door reflected the dim yellow light. As he prepared to enter, a dark figure flashed across the hallway in the distance. Slow, hunched over, but the way the person's shoulders were hunched, the heavy footsteps, made him shudder. Daniel quickened his pace, trying to get a better look, but the dark figure had turned a corner, disappearing. A premonition went off like an alarm in his heart. He pulled out his phone, calling Hammond, the police chief, directly. "Leonard Carson, has he been released?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "Yes, he was temporarily released 3 days ago. We're still gathering evidence to be able to prosecute. He has a history of violence, but there's no restraining order." "What's wrong?" Daniel tightened his grip on the phone. "I think he's lurking around the hospital. I just saw someone who looked like him, a lot like him. We'll send someone to check right away, but if you see anything suspicious, don't confront him alone." Daniel hung up, his eyes still fixed on the hallway. He didn't say it, but his stomach had gone cold. Worry began to cling to him, like fog clinging to a window. Silent, but persistent. An hour later, in the darkness behind the hospital, Leonard stood leaning against the fence. His hand held the knife, buried deep in his pocket. His coat hid most of his face. He looked at the small window, where Alina often sat drawing in the afternoon. The window was closed. The room lights were off. But to Leonard, that silence wasn't peaceful. It was a challenge. "That little brat," he whispered through his teeth, "won't open her mouth. Ever." In his head, jumbled memories returned. The sound of rope tying, the sound of doors slamming shut, the sound of the girl's fearful footsteps tiptoeing through the hallway. He didn't remember the dates, but he remembered the eyes. Those eyes weren't allowed to look up, weren't allowed to live. He smirked, like someone who had just found the entrance to a familiar hell. "I'm here." Under the patchy light from the hospital's backyard, Leonard's shadow blended into the night, like an old part of a crime that had never been punished. And this time, he didn't come to be silent. It was nearly midnight, the hospital hallway silent as if all sound had been sucked into the white walls. The dim ceiling lights shone on the cold tile floor, stretching the shadows of the on-duty staff like the silent ghosts of unhealed pain. In front of room 203, the special therapy room for Alina, 2 security guards stood watch. That was Daniel's order after suspecting Leonard was lurking around the hospital. Each shift lasted 4 hours, their eyes never leaving the door with the sign that read, "Restricted Area. No unauthorized entry." Inside, Alina was sleeping. She held the knitted doll close to her chest, her breath even, her eyelids fluttering as if dreaming a rare dream without darkness. Leonard clung to the shadows of the hallway, his eyes fixed on the camera hanging high. He had watched long enough to know the delay between scans, as well as the blind spots that the guards were most likely to neglect. Tonight, he didn't come to threaten. He came to end it. One guard had just left to take a call. The other had temporarily retreated to the restroom. 40 seconds, that's all he needed. Leonard crept to the door. He pulled out a stolen key card from a former employee, sandwiched between 2 layers of his coat. Beep. The door clicked open. Elena woke with a start. In the darkness, she saw a looming figure in the doorway, that feeling, like a familiar cut tearing through every layer of healing she had tried to stitch together in recent weeks. Leonard stood at the foot of the bed. His eyes were wild like a beast. His mouth was tight, hissing each word through his teeth. "You little bitch. You thought you could escape, huh?" Elena trembled. Her hands tightened around the doll. But it was too late. Leonard moved forward, grabbing her shoulder. He leaned close, his foul breath on her face, his other hand reaching behind her head, grabbing her hair. "I said, you should shut up forever." Just as he raised his hand to strike, the door burst open. Daniel appeared with 2 police officers. "Hands on your head, now!" Leonard turned sharply, but before he could react, the 2 officers pounced, pinning him to the floor, handcuffing him behind his back. "You have no right. She's my family. I'm her guardian," he yelled, his voice full of venom. Daniel said nothing. He stepped forward, standing between Elena and Leonard, just standing, like an unshakable wall. As Leonard was pulled up, he turned his head, his eyes blazing like dying embers, flaring one last time. "You think you can save her, huh?" Daniel replied, his voice soft, but each word like a nail being hammered in. "I don't think. I am." The air froze for 3 seconds. Then Leonard was dragged away, his mouth still hissing with hatred. Elena sat on the bed, unmoving. She hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, but in her eyes, something had just shattered. Not because of fear, but because for the first time, she wasn't abandoned. Daniel turned back. He walked slowly over, kneeling in front of her, not touching her, not forcing her to speak. But Elena, for the first time, reached out her hand, took his hand, small and cold, but gripping it tightly. And then her lips moved slightly, soundlessly, but very clearly. 2 words, slowly. It took almost 10 years to utter. Daniel held his breath. He looked at those tiny lips, then nodded. "I know." In that moment, that should have been full of fear, Elena had spoken, with her hands, with her eyes, with her moving lips. Something she had once thought she could never say. And Daniel had listened, without having to ask. The courtroom on the 3rd floor of the district courthouse was brightly lit under harsh white ceiling lights. Rows of wooden seats, packed with people, were so silent that the sound of a page turning echoed as clearly as the wind blowing through the palm of a hand. Elena sat in the front row, among strangers. To her left was Dr. Mary. To her right was Daniel, the only person she trusted when there was no one else to lean on. She didn't look at Leonard, nor did she look up at the judge's bench. Her hand tightened on the small sign placed on her lap, not yet raised, but the words were already written. Over the past 4 weeks, the whole country had learned her name. A girl locked in darkness for nearly 10 years, without papers, without a voice, without human rights. A man, her uncle, accused of imprisonment and abuse, as if from a horror story. Television reported, online news spread every detail, but no one knew the true look in that girl's eyes, except Daniel. Presiding over the trial was a stern female judge, her voice clear and decisive. Leonard sat across from her, still wearing a facade of calm. White shirt, neatly combed hair, but his eyes couldn't hide the ferocity hidden within. His defense attorney argued weakly, My client had no intention of abuse. He only wanted to isolate the child because of her special psychological condition. Daniel stepped up to the witness stand. No notes in hand. No need to prepare. Every word he spoke was a living truth etched on his heart. I was the first person to see Elena outside the prison cell called bedroom. I saw that she didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't move, for fear that just making a sound would get her beaten. The entire courtroom held its breath. I am also the one who witnessed Leonard Carson breaking into the treatment room, grabbing the girl's hair, intending to strike, while Elena had only just learned to smile again after many years. A video from a neighbor was shown. The image was blurry, but it was clear that Leonard was cursing outside the house door, his voice interspersed with phrases like, "She's a burden," "shouldn't have been born." Next were crime scene photos, ropes, moldy mattress, room without windows. Finally, the medical report. Severe psychological trauma, signs of prolonged malnutrition, old and new bruises on her back, arms, and neck. Dr. Mary was invited to speak. Elena may not speak with her mouth, but every scar on her body and in her brain is more eloquent evidence than any testimony. Leonard denied, "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to raise her. The kid is sick. She's been mute since she was little." The judge didn't waver. "You have the right to remain silent, but the record before us is not silent." In addition to the evidence from the past, the police also presented data collected on the night Leonard tried to break into the hospital to harm Elena. A video excerpt from a hallway camera was played on the big screen. A clear image of Leonard sneaking up on a maintenance worker, taking advantage of the moment the worker turned away to steal the key to the inpatient room. The investigating officer continued. "Upon arrest, we found a folding knife hidden in the left coat pocket of Mr. Leonard Carson. The weapon has been confiscated and transferred to the evidence room." The courtroom went silent for a few seconds. Daniel sat below, his eyes never leaving Elena, who was silently gripping his hand. He had not only destroyed her in the past, but had also returned, carrying a knife, with the intention of killing Elena's last chance of survival. After an hour of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Leonard Carson is sentenced to 25 years in prison for the crimes of aggravated child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and intentional infliction of injury. No one applauded, but the atmosphere erupted in silence. It was as if the entire room had just released a sigh so long that everyone had forgotten when they had started holding their breath. Irene, Elena's mother, was not prosecuted. She was identified as a victim who was completely dependent. But the court also declared that she had lost her legal guardianship because she was not competent to care for her. Daniel stood up. He stepped forward, taking Elena's hand. The girl stood up. Her eyes didn't blink. Her hand trembled slightly, but she still raised the white sign. The words were written in black marker, the strokes uneven, but no one could misread them. "I'm not scared anymore." Everyone in the room stood up. Unprompted, they began to applaud. Lightly at first, then more rapidly. Not for a victory, but for a life that had just escaped the darkness. Daniel turned to the judge. He submitted an application to become Elena's temporary guardian. The record was there. Financial ability was proven. Affection didn't need justification. The judge nodded, her eyes flashing with a look quite different from her initially stern voice. "Temporarily, Mr. Daniel Reed is appointed as the legal guardian of Elena Carson during the period of treatment and stabilization." Elena didn't understand all the terms, but she understood one thing. His hand was still holding hers, not letting go. Justice doesn't change the past, but it confirms that the pain was real, that a child who was once forgotten deserves to stand in the light. And today, Elena had stepped out, without a word, but loud enough for the whole world to hear. Elena's new room was on the second floor of Daniel's mansion, the window opening onto a sunlit garden where lavender bushes swayed as if breathing. The wall colors were soft, the white voile curtains fluttering in the breeze, the space so peaceful it was as if the outside world had never known a scream. Elena sat on the rug next to the bed, still holding her familiar knitted doll. Light streamed through the window, painting gentle streaks on her face. Her hair was longer than before. Her cheeks were slightly rosier. She still hadn't spoken aloud, but her expression was no longer that of a child on the run. Daniel walked in, carrying a large box. He set it on the table, breathing softly. Today, the post office brought 12 letters, 3 children's books, 2 toys, and a pair of pink knitted slippers, all addressed to you. Elena didn't react immediately. She looked up at him, her gaze still somewhat cautious, but no longer avoiding. "What do they write?" she asked with her hands, drawing on the small board. Daniel smiled slightly, taking a light blue envelope. A girl named Lily, 8 years old, wrote, "I used to be afraid of the dark too, but when someone holds my hand, it's not so scary anymore." Elena tilted her head. Her small hand squeezed the doll lightly. Daniel opened another letter, reading, "Dear little one, I don't know who you are, but I believe you are very strong. Live like a lamp. Don't turn off again." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Many people want to send gifts, send wishes, send even hope. But I only want one thing." Elena blinked, her cheeks flushed slightly. "What do you want?" she wrote on the board. Daniel sat down next to her. Placing his hand on his left chest, he smiled. "I only need one thing. Your smile." Silence. The wind in the garden gently rustled, carrying the scent of lavender and something as gentle as a stolen childhood afternoon, now returned. Elena lowered her head. She pulled a piece of paper from under her pillow. No one knew when she had hidden it. She put down the pen, trembling, but decisively. The letters weren't straight. The ink wasn't even. But 3 words appeared clearly. "I trust you." Daniel said nothing for a few seconds. His hand rested on her shoulder, very lightly, but surely, like the way he had always been there for her from the beginning. Not noisy, not rushed, just as steadfast as the ground beneath her feet. He leaned down, whispering softly in Elena's ear, "This time, no one will hurt you again?" Elena looked up. A smile bloomed very slightly, like an early spring flower, hesitant but unable to hide. No longer a twisted smile of fear, but a real smile, for the first time. Daniel knew that everything bad couldn't be erased immediately. But he also knew, with those 3 words, Elena had crossed the boundary of silence, entering a world where she was seen, trusted, and loved unconditionally. Sometimes, a person only needs one chance to restore their trust. Elena had said it not with words, but with trust. And Daniel, like a small lamp, had kept that light, with his whole life. A week had passed since Elena had officially moved into the mansion. Everything had changed for the better. As usual, on a weekend morning, Elena sat on the rug under the tree in the backyard, holding colored pencils. In front of her, a black sheet of paper covered with streaks of yellow, white, and orange. No specific shapes, just streaks of light curving as if dancing. She drew like this every day. Not much, not rushed, but regularly. Daniel didn't ask her what she was drawing. He just sat a few steps away, reading public letters, occasionally glancing at the girl. When one day, Elena pulled him over, placed his hand on the painting, and then drew a ray of light connecting from the painting to his hand. Daniel understood. That was how she said, "I'm learning how to feel the light." Dr. Mary often visited in the morning. The afternoon was for speech therapy with a specialist. Elena still didn't speak, but she listened, remembered, and began to react with her eyes, hand movements, even a slight nod. Irene had also come to live with them. A small room was prepared on the ground floor. She didn't say much, and didn't try to be a mother again. But every morning, she still made tea, still knocked on Elena's door as a clumsy greeting. Daniel didn't force the mother and daughter to start over. He understood that some cracks didn't need to be filled, just needed to learn how to live with them. That night, the backyard was quiet. Daniel sat on a stool, turning on the gentle classical music he always played every evening, Clair de Lune by Debussy. The song he had loved since childhood, also the one he had played for Elena from the very first night she came to live with him. He thought she was asleep. Her bedroom window was ajar, the yellow light in the room projecting a small figure curled up with the knitted doll onto the curtain. Just listening to the soft piano music drifting into the night, like a river of unspoken things. He didn't call out, didn't intend to only silently stand still watching and then walk away. Then, a very small sound, so small it seemed like the wind. "Uncle." Daniel raised his head. His heart stopped for a beat. "Daniel." The voice was weak, hoarse, but clear. No mistake, no imagination. He turned around, stepped into the girl's room. Elena was lying on the bed. Her eyes were still wide open, but her hand had released the doll. She looked at him, not afraid, not avoiding, just, for the first time, she dared to say someone's name. Daniel walked over, knelt down in front of the bed, took the girl's hand, his voice trembling. "You just spoke, Elena." "You spoke." Elena smiled. It wasn't clear if it was because she herself was surprised, or because he had heard. But that smile, to Daniel, was more than any miracle. Not every voice starts from the throat. Some voices take a lifetime to find again. That night, Elena had found herself again, with 2 simple words, but enough to rewrite her whole life. The small schoolyard was filled with sunlight, ribbons of color and paper balloons swaying in the light breeze as if even the air was smiling. On the makeshift stage, under the large oak tree, rows of white plastic chairs were neatly arranged for a graduation ceremony, unlike any other. Elena stood backstage holding a piece of paper folded in quarters. Simple white dress, hair tied back loosely, her eyes no longer hesitant, but sparkling with something. Not confidence, but courage. A year had passed. 12 months of therapy. Learning to read, learning to write, learning to face other people's eyes without shrinking. Dr. Mary stood beside her, nodding slightly. Daniel sat in the front row, among the other parents. He wore a white shirt, grey tie, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes never leaving Elena since she had stepped out. The principal read the list of students completing the special support program. When he reached Elena's name, the entire schoolyard went silent. The girl stepped forward, not faltering, not turning back. Just small steps, even and sure. Elena stood before the microphone. Her hand trembled slightly, but she didn't look down. Her voice, slow, small but clear, rang out. "I used to live in darkness." But a light came, not big, but enough for me to see the door. And from there, I learned how to step out. Thank you to the one who didn't turn away. The applause was deafening. Mary gently touched her chest. Daniel just bowed his head, tears falling slowly, but not hidden at all. Elena looked at him. For a second, she dropped the paper, ran down the stage and hugged Daniel. Her small arms tightened, her head resting on his shoulder. And for the first time, she spoke the words that this entire journey had led to. "I'm not trapped anymore. Because of you." Daniel squeezed those small shoulders lightly. He couldn't respond. His throat was choked, but in his heart, something had broken open. Not tears, but an old vow being healed. A month later, the Alina's Light Foundation was born. The headquarters was small, but warm, located in the community center. Daniel used his own assets to launch a program to help abused, isolated, undocumented children, the children who had once been unseen. The sign at the entrance was engraved with Alina's first words, "I trust." In a media gathering after the foundation's launch, a female journalist asked Alina, "If you could send one message to the world, what would you say?" Alina looked into the camera lens, not blinking, not reading from a paper. She answered with the very voice that had been buried in silence. "Look at the silent children. Maybe they're just waiting for someone to stop." The atmosphere in the meeting room was deathly quiet. Some people bowed their heads, others wiped their eyes. Daniel sat in the back, his eyes quiet but full of pride. To Daniel, Alina wasn't just a child he saved. Before, he was just a cold and insensitive businessman to society, but Alina appeared, not to be saved, but to give him a reason to become better. To Alina, Daniel wasn't a guardian. He was the light. The proof that people can love a child who is not blood-related just because she deserves to be loved. Darkness may steal voices, time, childhood, even hope, but trust, never. Alina's story is not just the tragedy of a forgotten child, but a mirror reflecting the terrifying silence of adults in the face of unspoken pain. How many children out there are living in darkness just because they don't know how to cry for help, and adults are too busy to stop? Will we choose to continue to turn away, or become the first person to step up and say, "You don't have to endure this alone anymore"? Thank you for listening to this story with all your heart. Each of your emotions is the light for Alina and children like her. Wishing you happiness every day, and see you again in the next stories, where we will continue to seek truth, compassion, and hope.